Welcome to a new episode of Observability Talk. One of our objectives from this podcast is to look at observability from the lenses of various practitioners in the space. Today, we are glad to introduce you to Safir, who is a seasoned technology leader specializing in site reliability, DevOps, and platform engineering. With over 18 years of experience, he has a solid background in cloud and infrastructure management, working with both large scale enterprises and startups. Safir is also the author of a book titled Architecting Cloud Native Serverless Solutions and has spoken at various conferences on the topic of observability, DevOps, and site reliability engineering. A warm welcome to you, Safir. Uh, my
Thank
first
you.
question to you is today we see a lot of people working in DevOps, L1, L2 monitoring space, doing software engineering, people doing chaos engineering sort of work, and each of one of them calling themselves sort of SRE, right?
Right. Yeah.
So I just want you to define SRE for us, as well as
hmm
what sort of responsibilities SRE takes care of.
Got it. Yeah. See, the foundational role here, right? See, the titles will vary depending on the company's culture, organization, historic reasons, right? It could happen, right? And I have, even in my career, I have gone through a bunch of different titles and all. It never, only recently it picked up as an SR, site reliability engineer as a title. So I started as a Sys Admin, network engineer, network analyst, then systems engineer, systems architect, things like that. Right. So it depends on the company to a point, right? What title it would be. But what we need to look at foundationally is a role should be defined by what is the primary expectation for that job, right? And for site reliability engineering, right? If we look at the history of how it evolved, right? See, it came as a response to the challenges of scaling lab scale infrastructure with the conventional dev versus ops model, right, or the sysadmin model, right. The fundamental issue with I was a sysadmin, by role and by function, I was practically a sysadmin essentially in the beginning of my career. So I can speak to this from the experience, right. So the problem with the sysadmin role was that, as the infrastructure grew, right, your sysadmin team also had to be scaled linearly. The reason for that, as your infra grows, you need more people to fix your problem, even if it is the same problems or things like that. Because for the scale, you will not be able to handle it beyond that point, right? So that's one fundamental problem, right? And the other problem is that the focus was on solving the current issue, right? Of course, we always have to focus on solving the current issue, right? But the
Right.
way it goes is that you get an alert, you pull up some run book or based on your history and experience, you fix that problem. And if it is something undocumented, probably if you follow best practices, you will document it and use it as a runbook for the next time, right? That is where it was. But if you look at the whole scheme, right, it was pretty reactionary, all right?
True.
And
Very true.
what didn't work for large scale, right? They cannot scale this sysadmin teams linearly, right? So it has to be a non-linear to be precise, right? That is again from a practical standpoint, it has to be like that. So that was the first thing. And the second thing is the approach of reactive mechanism itself, right? That doesn't work. And the way Google and most of the others define SRE, right? The proposition is that change that reactionary model by applying a software engineering mindset to the large scale and scalability and reliability problems, right? And that's a shift, right, in terms of mindset and approach. Now, this would mean that any operation task you have to perform repeatedly should be automated out, right? And to the possible extent, sometimes it's not fully possible, but you should still have to cover whatever cannot be automated. You should still have a standard SOP, which is up to date and all those stuff. Now, that was very basic stuff, and this is in the terms of SRE language, this is called toil reduction. The work itself is
Correct.
toil because you have to keep toiling on fixing the same things over and over again. So toil reduction essentially translate automating things in a software way, software engineering way, right? But it's not just about automating routine tasks, right? It's also about building tools and platforms that improves the reliability, makes developers and the engineers' life easier, right? All those things. So that was one of the first key principles of SRE, right? And wherever you set up SRE, that is one of the foundational things, right? Now, also the other thing, right? reliability of these systems are essentially, dependent on observability, and that's non-negotiable thing, right? So it has to be, it is dependent anyway, and that is one of the key responsibilities of SREs, right? It not only, involves setting up your, observability infrastructure. Of course, that is one of the baseline responsibilities, but it's also about looking at, what is the ecosystem, what kind of, best practices you do, work with software engineer as a liaison for, observability, and ensure that all critical services are alerting and reaction mechanism.
Right.
So that happens. Now, the other one of the responsibilities and roles is incident management. It's very critical, right? And some very big companies have dedicated IAM teams, but in most cases, SRE is, even in those cases, right? Including those cases, SRE is the one responsible for defining what should be the process look like. If you can introduce automation into it, what rules should be there, and what should be the end result of going up to the postmortem level, right? So that is the idea. And of course, change and release management also kind of rolls up to this responsibility up to a point. The other thing, of course, that thing that we call about large scale systems, systemic reliability and all, those comes as other responsibility.
Right.
So that again, you have to work with devs as your partner, right? Because at the end of the day, the folks who build those systems are your first champions of reliability, right? So SREs has to work with them and eliminate single point of failures, improve your DER strategies, disaster recovery, business continuity process, things like that. And of course, the last but not the least is when we talk about SREs, we talk about SLAs and SLOs, right? That is kind of the KPIs or the performance metrics for SRE. So that of course is one of the goals that has to be derived from whatever SRE does. So as long as you fit into most of these categories, you are an SRE, so to speak, and
Right. Yeah, very, very true. So if I say that a SRE actually is more software engineer than a sysadmin,
correct.
would that be a fair statement?
It is, because you have to apply that engineering mindset, right?
Right.
You are more than just an operator. You are thinking about the problem, what could be a systemic solve to it, and then take it forward, right? Otherwise,
Right.
I could very well find a solution once and keep repeating it monkey hitting on the keyboard, right? That's possible. That's not what we want, right?
And
So
somewhere you need to also get it engineered within your application such that you
correct.
continuously improve your reliability, right? So that
Yeah.
sort of
See,
mindset
yeah.
comes more from software engineering side. Yeah,
True.
understood.
See,
Go ahead.
that's something I tell people over and over again, right? Reliability is a feature of your software product. Now we may not look at it that way because it's not apparent, right? Until something breaks, of course. Right? So
Correct.
it is an inherent feature, and we need to treat it that way, and only then the real SRE, you will get the real benefit out of it, sir.
Right. So, I mean, this is
Mm-hmm.
very well defined. I think a lot of people who generally compare that, okay, I am an SRE if I am doing only observability, I am an SRE if I am doing only DevOps, or I am an SRE if I'm doing like toil reduction or chaos engineering,
Mm-hmm.
right? But looks like it is much wider than that,
Correct.
because each one of them are only subsection of what an
Correct.
SRE
See,
is supposed to be
yeah.
doing. Yeah.
See, having that perspective is what is important, right? Because see, depending on the company, which team you are in, how your teams are structured, you might only end up doing some part of it. But what you need to understand is you shouldn't say, look, this is my part, that is not my part, right? That is not the way it is. SR is a holistic
Cool.
approach. You have to be ready for everything.
Cool. Now that we have defined SRE, right? Given
Mm-hmm.
today's enterprises are digitally transforming themselves, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
And they are becoming more digital first. Almost every vertical today is some way or the other, in some format, some scale, digitally transforming themselves and then trying to serve their customers digitally. In such an environment, do you think the SRE practice becomes very critical for such enterprises? And if not, what would be the alternative?
Correct. Yeah. See, as you said, rightly pointed out, right? Every company is transforming and becoming kind of a digital, company, right? And there is also this saying that every company is a data company now because customer
Right.
data, business data. That's what they operate on, right? And the digital infrastructure
Very
built on top of it, right? So see, the success of any enterprise firm, is primarily dependent on the trust of the customers, right?
right.
They essentially they look for what is the value they can derive out of it, or companies look what is the value they are providing, right? And you deliver the value, right? They will honor you and appreciate you and be with you, right? And that is how you grow. Now the problem, however, is that you do the digital transformation, but your services are not delivered in a reliable or available way. Then the customers are going to lose trust on you, right? And that is why SRE is very critical, because reliability, if you have to deliver a service, deliver it with reliability. Remember, it's a feature, right? It's an inherent feature of your product. You treat it that way, and that is what is why it is important, right? And see, now or later, enterprises will have to embrace reliability as a practice. But it is not to say that enterprises don't do this now, right? They all have their processes, procedures. But the problem is, once you embrace digital transformation, the pace at which you do things will change, right? Because if you have to go with faster, the digital economy, right? You have to move faster, the faster time to market, how you deliver stuff, at the earliest, right? When that happens, more changes occur to your software infrastructure. Changes are the primary root cause for any sort of reliability issues or scalability issues, right? And you cannot avoid changes because that is how you deliver the value. So it's you have to balance it out, and you need to have reliability and reliability engineering to run this, right? And to be honest, there is no alternative to it, all right? But let's be clear. See, when we say there's no alternative to site reliability or reliability, it doesn't mean that you have to have an SRE team to do that, right? That's not the point. Let's say see, you will have an existing engineering team for your digital transformation. They themselves can do it, right? It's not about, again, it's about the principles and practices that you do rather than your role and what is your title, right? So it can be done. So enterprises have the choice to decide who will implement reliability, but they don't have the choice to decide okay, I can opt out of reliability. That is not going to happen.
So just to extend this, do you also see the way the application architecture has evolved over time? That has also pushed for a higher need of these reliability engineers because of earlier, as you said, right, that it was simple. So it could
Correct.
be still monitored in whichever way, maybe a little reactive, but it could still be monitored, right?
Right.
But because of the infrastructure complexity, application architecture evolving, scale which we are dealing with today, do you see the combination of this has
Yeah.
also
Right.
made this requirement very useful?
Yeah, absolutely. See, you're spot on that, right? Because it's no more, see, when we started, learning computer science, it was about, the three-tier architecture world. You had a simple,
Right.
application, front-end database, and, so on and so forth, right? It is not that case anymore, right? We have distributed systems. Even see, earlier, when we refer to distributed systems, it was database systems like Hadoop or those kind of things, right? Which have some, level of complexity. Now, even your microservice architecture is quite complex and distributed, probably more than your data system, right?
Right.
So that complexity definitely brings about, problems of, reliability, right? And as long as you have too many test files, too many protocols to talk to, and you don't know where exactly, things are breaking, right? So it's ever more important, to be honest.
Now that we have talked about SRE and that sort of create a business case that digital transforming enterprises should actually be using SRE in some form or fashion. See, you have been setting up SRE practices in your past organizations. Can you provide a brief view into what really goes into setting up a SRE practice in an enterprise?
Yeah. See, before we talk about the practice itself, right? Prerequisite to implementing, the SRE anywhere, the primary thing is the buy-in from the leadership, from the top leadership, all right? And the top leadership has to, give that buy-in or, sponsorship, as we call it, right? And that is not all. They also have to percolate that message to, the lower, levels of the management, the chain. It has to go down the chain essentially, so that everybody understands this is a priority for us. So the reason for this, right? Site reliability engineering, like other initiatives like DevOps, platform engineering, these are all overlapped. But all these things, right? I put them into a category of engineering excellence, so to speak. These are not the foundation. Not always. You look at it as a foundation for developing software, right? It comes as like for a lot of companies, it comes as an afterthought, and it happens, right? That's the way things works, right? The issue is there is going to be always a war for prioritization, right? My feature rollout versus my reliability, implementation. What should I prioritize? And that can create conflicts, reprioritization, and like slowing down of like adopting the SRE practices, right? So it has to be communicated that it's a priority for the leadership or the company's direction, right? So that's the primary thing wherever we go, right? And if you look at it, right, there are two directions from which the leadership comes to this. One is reactive, one is proactive. The proactive ones are like the leaders who are starting a company or are in the early stages of their company, and they from their past experience and like of course like their thought process think that okay, reliability has to be like baked into early on, right? And they set out to build a team and like that. And obviously in this environment it's easier to implement SRE. Now, on the other hand, most of the time, what happens? It's a reaction to like things that already happened, right? You already have a sizable infrastructure. You are hit with like outages, things like that. So you have reliability issues and infra, scaling issues already, and then you as a reaction you do it. Nothing wrong with that. Again, it depends on the business's needs of the time, right? But the thing is, it's a little bit more complicated, like implement things in that kind of that kind of an environment. And that is where like more buy-ins definitely required. And coming to the approach itself, right? See, you are going to like do something new, right? Or comparatively new thing, right? To the enterprise, right? Now the first thing is to understand the lay of the land, understand like what are the top reliability problems they are facing, right? So to know that, you have to talk to the leaders, talk to the people on the ground. If you see customer reports or whatnot, find them, read them. Look at if there is some sort of incident management or even incident reporting. Read the reports. Look at whatever metrics is available from whatever tools. So which gives you a full picture, kind of a decent picture, right? So in effect, the way I put it is like treat reliability as a feature or like a product that you are going to implement, and these are your user interviews. Okay, so you always, when you implement a product, you always have to do that initial user interviews to like, find out what is required, what is missing, and how should we, drive this whole effort, right? So think of those feedback that come from those user interviews as well, features to be implemented within SRE. Of course, we have our base principles and what to do, but it should also be tailored to like what is required by the enterprise, right? That is where you start.
Right.
And once you understand the priorities and what is missing, right? You will have to definitely like implement practices and set up systems for that. And depending on again like what you learn from the other previous step, you might either have to build something greenfield, or you might be like augmenting the existing systems, right? Whichever it is, you will have to do it, right? And going back to the SRE responsibilities, right? I would say like here observability and incident management would be like your top priorities, right? Again, priorities would come from somewhat from whatever your user interviews. But if you look at it from an absolute perspective, again, this will align also from the feedbacks essentially, because you need to have observability to understand your systems. And then second is ultimately what is important is customers. Customers are important, impacted by outages, which means you need to have an incident management process to sort that out. And the incident management process would be complete only if you have the backing of observability, proper observability, right? So that becomes kind of your like the baseline, right? And at some point again like change management also comes under this portfolio, right? And the next priority would be to look at what is the source of the highest level of toils in your organization across all teams, right? And a lot many times, right, the root cause of the toil itself would be systemic problems, right? But nobody's going to listen to you to change fix systemic problem, because it's a longer time investment, right? So they won't be interested in that until you give them some breathing time. For that, you have to automate out some of the top priority problems. All right.
Right.
That's where you have to start. And Once you do that, and once you strike some sort of, right balance between what you did in the automation side and got some, saved some time, right, for the developers, right? Then you partner with them to solve the systemic problems as well. And then your Toil and systemic solutions can go, hand in hand. But on the outset, you have to start with solving some of their top burning problems, right? That is how you have to start on that. And once you get these two things sorted, right, and of course, you will develop tools and platforms and everything for this. And but beyond this one, you will be kind of reasonably stable, I would say. Again, stability is relative, but still much better than where you started off, right? And then of course, you go to into the more mature part of working with developers to build reliable systems, improve reliability of the existing systems, BCPDR strategies, and things like that. All right, and chaos tests, whatnot, like everything that is required for a much reliable and resilient infrastructure. That's what you go about doing, right? And I would say that is where the technical aspects mostly you have to start with. Again, this is not a complete list, right? But this is where you start. But one thing that is almost as important as all these points and should run in parallel with these efforts from day one, is your people, essentially. Right. So this is very, very critical. I have to stress it, and I can't stress this enough. See, when you are going into an enterprise or you are starting to build reliability, right? You already have an infra, you already have software systems, which means there are also people and teams, one or more teams, in different shapes and forms. They are doing parts of reliability or infra management and things like that, release management, right?
Right.
Now, these teams, one way is depending on how your management structure and your buy-in works. You could either absorb them, mold them into your reliability team. If that is not possible, then you should find a good synergy with them and work with them as partners. If this doesn't work, see, again, this is a bit of people management and political management, to be honest, right? So if you don't get it right, other initiatives may not go as smooth as possible, right? So invest in the people, and of course, hire people, train people, and build. It's a continuous endeavor. It will have to go on and on, but it's very important sort out people.
Right. So whenever you are implementing these SRE practices, have you come across where you had to balance out the cost part of it? Because obviously reliability is coming at a cost, right?
Correct, yeah.
Because if it is not thought through when application was being built as a feature, as you mentioned a couple of times, right? And if it is an afterthought, then obviously it becomes like I am already at, let's say, 95% of reliability. Increasing it to 99% is much more costly than how much revenue you will get by increasing that 4%, right?
True, yeah.
So what sort of cost consideration actually comes into setting up this practice?
Right. You see, the cost will come in two ways, right? One is, investing in people. The other is, investing in systems, right? On the system side, of course, we need to look at what is the expectation that the customers have on us, or what is the goal we have set for ourselves. Let's say, do you want 99.99% reliability, or 999, or 99 or whatnot, right? So
correct.
Based on that, and sometimes also compliance, depending on the nature of the business, right? You will have set up certain things, right? And there is no way out of it, and that is part of the business, cost, right? It will have to be there. But if you look at some of the reliability things, you could make choices about tools, vendors that you use, or you can also space out your initiatives into different quarters to manage the budgeting, right? But there are certain base things that you cannot compromise on, incident management, some part of observability. Again, observability goes in layers, right? It's not it's in one shot, everything done kind of thing, right? So any kind of solutions, you have to consider multiple things. One is build versus buy, right? That is also there. What kind of solutions you use, when you start using it, and again, it will all tie up to what is your priorities at the moment, right? You could wait for let's say tracing to happen till next year, but metrics is probably non-negotiable. And how long you persist your logs versus if you have a compliance thing, probably you want to persist for 6 months, or even 6 days would work otherwise, right? And again, it varies from component to component as well. So For every system, you have to make those kind of choices depending on the cost. But cost is very, very important, and that is where this entire stream of FinOps as a
Right.
initiative has come up, right? Everybody looks at cloud costing, FinOps, how do you manage cost and things like that. It's very important.
Right, right. Safir, whenever you have set up these SRE practices at different place, right? You talked about that you try creating a baseline sort of thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
I am very interested to know the gaps which you find when you are setting up this baseline. Where do
Mm-hmm.
you find these gaps more often? I mean, I remember talking to customers, and then they generally talk about they already have some sort of monitoring already in place. Like you said, right? It is mostly reactive. But
Correct, yeah.
when you started doing some baseline checks, uh, in which area, which component, or which side of things where you find most of the gaps, or what are the low hanging fruits which you believe should be tackled very quickly, which will improve the reliability, I mean, in much lesser time.
Got it. See on the observability front of things, right? Again, we find gaps in a lot of things, right? Like not just observability, reliabilities, focus things, process itself, some of them would be outdated, run books could be outdated. So we find
Right.
gaps in almost everything. But if we focus on observability side, right? See, the way you have to look at it is, again, observability is just like reliability, it's a journey, right? And it evolves over a time. And different, see, if you look at it, right, there are different organizations which have come up with different observability maturity models. AWS has one, Grafana Labs has one, and a bunch of companies. So you just Google for observability maturity model, and you will see a whole bunch of things, right? But the thing is, in almost all these models, right, the first thing is always to establish an observability baseline. Okay, and to do that, you have to first take stock of what is existing, like what kind of solutions you have, what is it providing you, right? In terms of data points, right? And the first thing I would say to establish a baseline is to implement component level observability, like your software systems, observability at the component
Right.
levels, right? Because every other thing is going to be an aggregate of your components actually at in some levels and some form, right? So that is going to be your primary baseline. And if you look at it further, right, in the same implementing component, level observability itself, observability, as we all talk about, it has three pillars, right? Metrics, logs, and monitoring, right? And this is not personal view, but I think it logically would make some sense that metrics should be the first priority, and logs comes after that, and traces are going to be the last one, right?
Right.
The reason for also that, right? Also, you get the nature of your systems by looking at the metrics. Logs are not something that you can make sense out of immediately, right? The
Right.
other part is that, in terms of application development, logs is something that comes naturally to developers. They will log for things, and it's guaranteed that, at some form or shape, you will have application logs somewhere at least locally, if not centrally, organized. So that's why
Right.
logs can wait. But metrics is, it doesn't, it's not a natural thing to implement, because different standards, different companies have different ways of implementing it at different times, right? So
Right.
it's not that easy. So that's why your first priority should be metrics, and it makes sense from usefulness as well as cost perspective. Logs are costlier, and traces are even more costlier in terms of engineering as well as systems, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So when once you decide that, okay, I have to sort out metrics, what SREs usually recommend is that the golden signals, what we call golden signals, right?
Correct.
It typically contains latency, traffic, your overall traffic, errors, what kind of issues you are getting, and saturation, is your capacity totally saturated or not, right?
Yeah.
For a given
Yeah.
system, you find the right signals. You will get a lot of metrics from any system, right? Now out of
Correct.
that, you find what is aligning with these four categories. Pick only few metrics. If you overdo
Right.
the metrics also, you are just going to drown in alerts and things, right? So you have to have the right signals in the right category, but minimal, whatever gives you the first. See, the principle is that if you're getting an alert, it should be an actionable alert. If that is not the case,
Correct.
no point in setting an alert and looking at a threshold or a metric at that point in time, right? So it should be
Right.
the way,
Right.
right? And that will give you a baseline. It's my that's my theory of doing things. But just to add to that, right, it's also equally important to have some sort of high level, metrics at business level, right? This involves looking at your traffic numbers. That's a very basic thing, right? You can anywhere do this. It comes from your
Right.
load balancers and proxies and front-end services, right? You can do this. If you go a little deeper, there are basic business metrics like DAU, daily average users, MAU, monthly average users, and you can also look at week on week patterns. So this in itself will give you some sense of baseline, right? Because while I said that, I stress that component level observability is the baseline. These are also part of your baseline. It has to be.
Right.
That is when you can easily detect a problem, right? See, you might have a self-zero issue in your database, but does that imply that your user is not able to log in or do their primary responsibilities, right? So to do that, you need that micro as well as macro level observability to a point, right?
Understood.
Again, this you can get that baseline, right? And once you get the baseline, you then climb the observability maturity ladder, right? Then you get real user monitoring RAM, right? And synthetic monitoring, and tracing, and a whole lot of whatever you want to implement on micro and macro levels, right? So that is how you evolve, but baseline is always like.
So this is something which like we were also looking at creating sort of a observability maturity model for our customers. And I think what you rightly said is that you start with the component part and then go to the log and then go to the application, and that basically will give much deeper visibility once you start building one on top of the other. In fact, at ViewNet, we basically have, we were discussing, right, that we have innovated on top of this something called business journey observability, right? So we bring in the business part on top of it.
Safir, it was interesting. Yeah. So see, just to add to that, right, you have that right model, right? So the another way, a lot of SREs, so we look at, we look in this domain is, we call it critical workflows. Every business, everything, service has certain critical journeys. You will have a bunch of user journeys, through your system. Out of that, there are critical ones, and monitoring them or looking at them and seeing if they're succeeding or what is the observability angle to that. That's very important. That's very important actually.
Safir, you have been working on various e-commerce companies or earlier other digital companies, right? And some of the e-commerce companies are known for their annual sales event. And that I've been told by multiple people now that the whole process actually up to that event, from preparing the infrastructure, preparing the systems, almost like a 9-month affair, right? Can you talk about a little bit about how somebody like these large enterprises goes about preparing, or what is the process which they basically follow to prepare for such events?
See, the most important thing right now about this kind of things is planning, right? You cannot do it on the D-Day, right? It has to be planned out thoroughly, right? And typically it takes at least a quarter. It again depends on what all things you start at, but minimum is 1 quarter. The rest depends actually, right? And when you have to start something like this, you need some sort of an input about what is going to go down on that sale event, right? And that typically comes from business. They would say okay, look, this year, we are going to do this thing, this, we are going to roll out this feature, or we want this, right? They won't even say feature, right? We want this particular kind of experience, or and based on that, we expect that we can attract so much and so on traffic or some customers, right? They will talk in those customer numbers and things like that, how much product they can sell, what kind of offers they would want to roll out, right? What kind of promotions they will run, things like that, right? And so once that comes out, right? Of course, you have to build, some of them will be you might already have those kind of features, but there will also be a whole bunch of features that has to be rolled out, right? Because changes has to be has to keep happening, so that you can engage the customers, right? So once as that happens, right, all these requirements will translate to the increasing number of requests. Obviously, it has to, right? Let's say you add an additional widget to your page, that is going to do its own request to the backend, right? So it adds up basically, all right? And it's not just about the one that is receiving the request, right? It will fan out basically, right? That service will require 4 other services. That's basically the microservice architecture, right? So it will fan out and it could fan out, linearly, or it could fan out like an exponential, right? It depends on the nature of the question, like services, how they work, right? So it has to happen, which means like the respective engineer or switcher, responsible for like implementing these changes, right? They have to come up with some sort of a number of requests they need to support from the outside, and also like the number of requests they will send out to like the other services. And of course this would require capacity at their end. Also it will translate in capacity for the dependent services or downstream services, right? So everybody has to do these calculations, work out on like these numbers, and get their capacities like worked out with capacity allocation teams or your core infrastructure and like systems teams, right? That has to happen.
Right.
Okay. Now, once they get it, of course, like the capacity will be allocated, features will be rolled out, right? But this is all based on somewhat theoretical numbers, right? Because of course, it has it has a method to it. It has a past experience and like the foundation to it, right? But still, it is on paper, right? Now, it need to be like tested out in like in reality, in the real world, right? So what we can do the best beforehand, before the event figure this out, is do a stress test or like load testing, right?
Right.
Now that load test has to happen at overall like let's say it's an e-commerce site, at the e-commerce site level, search search or whatever those features you have tested out. You might also want to test out like each services, core services, like how they are holding up and things like that,
right?
And typically, this is a huge exercise which could run up to a month, before the event itself. Like, that could happen, right? And yeah, so that will happen. And the one thing that we wouldn't forget, but like one thing that doesn't get that much visibility in this thing is like the impact this has on your infra and core services. All right.
Okay.
Because they also have to scale, right, at the end of the day. We, of course, they allocate the capacity, that is one thing. But they also have their control systems, which might be taking like additional traffic. And most importantly, right, look at observability, right? As an application owner, I would say, look, I need 1,000 more like cores or like 1,000 more ports to be run. But every one of the 1,000 ports are going to send like ton of metrics to the observability backend, right? So you have to increase the capacity of your like backend systems and control systems as well. You have to increase your write path. You also have to improve your read path. It's very important. This is something that a lot of observability teams miss, because we accept the request, then we assume that like the pattern of usage for us would be like as before. It doesn't happen, right? Let's say an even sale event hits, every senior engineer is going to open like 5 dashboards and then keep hitting refresh, and every single one of this essentially like goes and fetches like a whole bunch of data, right? So you have to put controls in place. You have to make sure that your read layer is scaled up and things like that. So all those impacts will come there, right? And in addition to all this, right, people will also make structural changes to their infrastructure by like implementing new DR strategies, new SOPs, running chaos engineering, right? And there are things called degradation lever, where like some anticipated eventuality, some problem hits. What is the way to give a reduced but like availability based like user experience? You still be available, but reduce the user experience a little, while still serving the primary partner. So those kind of things has to be worked out. So I think that pretty much gives a hope that
this gives me. I mean, in just 5 minutes, you have tried explaining the kind of work which you guys would have done right before this annual sale event. Is just amazing. I mean, I'm thinking about so many things you need to think through, and not only from the development side, like you said, right, the control system, observability system, everywhere you need to take care of those TPS, EPS, and scale them accordingly, right? And the last part which you talked about was very interesting. Everybody's opened a dashboard and then continuously checking whether his service or application is running or not, right? That would be putting in so much load on the observability systems itself.
See, observability is taken for granted, right? It is available is the assumption, right? And nobody thinks about the scaling of the system itself, right? So it's for the reliability or observability teams to take care of that.
Correct. Yeah, people generally assume that anyway somebody is there, somebody is monitoring, and they will take care of figuring out when things are going wrong and then let us know, sort of thing, right?
Right. Yeah.
This is very interesting. So, Safir, coming to something which has been happening for all of us for last couple of years, is
Mm-hmm.
generative AI. Where
Right.
do
Yeah.
you think in this whole mix of so much complexity,
Mm-hmm.
so much of different thing which an SRE goes through, right? Where do you think this generative AI as a technology
Mm-hmm.
can actually help the SRE team as well as overall in general on observability and reliability part of it?
Yeah. You see, this is going to happen in a few places, right? Like again, generative AI is quite disruptive, right? So we cannot anticipate what all things it will do in the future. But at
Right.
least from the onset, whatever we have seen so far, what we can assume or imagine, right? I see it happening in a few places. The first one obviously is a no-brainer, programming, that's what,
Yes.
it has been doing a lot of things. And
Correct.
my only thing there is I have slightly, SRE or any infrastructure perspective that more than helping in writing code, generative AI is valuable in writing test cases or your
Right.
testing and the other other things, right? Because
Correct.
those are the things that people leave out. And if you could give a framework or boilerplate for those kind of things, it helps a lot. It goes along, right? So that's programming is one thing. The other thing obviously is incident management, right? So the IM is always a game of context, right? And use of past experience to solve the present problems, right?
Right. Right.
And I see AI, helping with providing the necessary context, stitching information from different systems together, with the context, and of course, it even going to the length of writing the postmortem reports, right? So it could, with all those context, it can do that. That's one thing. The other thing that typically happens with infra teams or DevOps or SRE, everybody, right? Is supporting the fellow developers and teams about their queries, their requests, things like that. A lot of value usually goes into that. Now, if you have some sort of like an internal, an AI that can work like an internal support team, right? Which can answer common queries, dole out suggest basic solutions, even talk about what are the available services in infra and things like that, right? That's one thing that can do. Lot of things happening. I see, but some of them would be alert correlation, how do you correlate? A lot of things that happen. Again, context investment, right? I would say, that is the context building in general, analytics for observability, things like that. All right, and so again, you can go on and on with a lot of problems where this can be helped because everywhere there is some sort of applicability, right? But
Yeah.
in general, right,
Yeah.
the way I see for SRE capabilities or any internal capabilities, right? RAG, right? The retrieval augmented generation. That's what is more important because all these things that SREs for observability and everybody internally deals with are proprietary information or information specific to the your enterprise, right? So RAG is quite important there. But yeah, again, that's where I would say where we are going.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, very, very true, Safi. Thank you
Mhm.
so much for talking about this. See, in fact, we also felt the way which you talked about, right? That when an incident happens, the next step for most of the people are to figure out how do I solve this, right?
Right.
And this is where generative AI may actually be very helpful because it has so much of information. I mean, if it is trained by internet data,
Mm-hmm.
uh, somebody would have definitely seen that problem earlier, and somewhere some resolution steps on
Mm-hmm.
resolution might be
Right. Yeah.
available, right? And if
Right.
you
Right.
ask that question to this, and if it able to list down, okay, these are the 5 steps you need to do to resolve this,
Right.
that will definitely do wonders for people, right? I mean, their ability to resolve a problem quickly will become very, very easy, very, very simple, right?
So yeah,
That
see,
is
yeah, that is true. See, look at the incidents, right? They are time critical, right? And
correct.
that point, that is not a point where you should have to employ your full cognitive ability and take a cognitive
Correct.
overload, right? That's why we have
Right.
run books and people and process, right? So that you can mindlessly
Correct.
operate those kind of things, right?
Right.
Now you
Right.
add generative AI into the mix, it's going to get much better, right? And as long as we build it reliably, I would say that's going to add a lot of value.
Right. Right. No, I think what you said is very right, and this brings to one of my favorite
Mm-hmm.
question, which I generally ask people
Okay.
who have always been very hands-on on managing infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, is the most frequent way of resolving a problem is still restart? I mean, restart service, restart process, restart system, and so
Yeah,
on.
see, the fundamental question is, have you tried, turning it on and off, right? That's the legendary question that, goes around, right? See, see, I have done this, at least in the start of my career, like, more than I would, like to admit. And it's a remedy, so to speak, right? So the problem,
Right.
the thing is, like, you run into a point where, like, your typical, problem solving abilities, run into a wall, and, the only other thing you can do is reset the whole thing, right? Which is like, restart for, like, a server or an application, right? It works to a point. The issue there is that, like, what do you do after that? Let's say it recovered. Let's say that, we are super lucky and, it recovered, right? How do you figure out, like, what went on, and, like, how do you, like, prevent it from happening again, right? For that, you need the context, some of it which, you would get from the observability systems. But if you are going to, like, knock something down, before that, at least, collect as much relevant information as possible, right? If you have a, you can pull a, profile, from, Java, your Java application, whichever application, or you get a trace, or, like, pull logs, whatever. So in the Kubernetes world, like, if you don't have centralized logging, a lot of your logs will be lost the moment, you restart the whole thing, right? So those things can happen. So try to pull out as much context as possible. Make sure that you run out of every other go before doing this. And even if you have to do it, you have to do it in a rolling restart fashion, right? So that, everything is not broken for, your end user, or, like, your down upstream, right? Just to happen. But
Right.
again, that's, your last resort essentially.
Right, right. I mean, I have used this as first, foremost resort most of the time when I don't know what is really happening, and
Correct, yeah.
I mean, most of the time system has come back and worked. So, I mean, I have not been an SRE, so I'm free
Okay.
to do that, right? But yeah, I mean, I understand that SREs have to be very, very careful in restarting system without collecting whatever information they can collect.
Correct, yeah.
It is very, very true, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, absolutely, yeah.
just one other thing I want to close before I close, right? I just wanted to understand
Mm-hmm.
this part that you have worked on different social media platforms like LinkedIn, Flipkart, and so on, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do you see this observability as a platform?
Okay.
Because we are very much closely associated with observability. So I wanted to always ask this: how you see
Mm-hmm.
observability different when it comes to each of these past tenures of yours?
Got it. Yeah, interesting question. See, I don't want to, really compare and contrast here, but let me, cover a few, themes or, points I noted, right? See, large enterprises, obviously they have, like, sizable infrastructure, right? And they usually tend to build their own, like, observability systems, right? And at the
Right.
scale, it makes a lot of sense, as well. It was for such large, see, as as your, volume of your infra and, like, your, observability data goes up. If you have a vendor, the vendor cost also, goes up exponentially, right? That happens. And sometimes, it's also possible that, your vendor may not be, built for that, because every service, SaaS service is basically built for, like, an average mid-sized customer, right? And so probably, you are in an extreme where, like, it may not hold up that well, unless, like, it is done, in that fashion, right? So it can
Right.
happen, right? So then, the question of, build versus buy, comes up, in front of the leadership, right? And typically, such enterprises would, like, choose to build. That's what happens. And this I have seen, like, as a pattern in a bunch of places. Now the issue, however, is that, a lot of leaders, right, they don't realize that, like, what you save on this vendor cost, right? At least part of it will, you will have to spend on engineering and infrastructure,
Right.
because it's not a freelance, right? Observability is a costly business, whether you do it on
Correct.
your own, or, like, somebody else do it for you, right?
Right.
So
Right.
that's going to happen, right? It's continuous investment, and, you stop doing that, and, it will stop providing value. You cannot just, say that, okay, my observability team set up the observability and we are good. Let us, redeploy them on something else, or, like, we don't have funding for, something, right? It doesn't work. So that's something to be, very careful about, right? And in all these organizations, right, tracing is the last thing to get implemented, and rightfully so, because, costs are
Right.
associated with it, both in terms of engineering as well as infra, right? Because everybody, every application developer has to get involved in implementing tracing, like, in some way or the other, right? Obviously, there is auto instrumentation and things like that, but, it still doesn't work, as we plan all the times, right? Especially in high performance systems. So that is always there. And another thing is alert correlation. I think I mentioned it already in another answer, right? Alert correlation is quite important. I can't stress this enough because I have been in the trenches as an SRE, right? You get an alert, get in that context and seeing what other alerts are firing, what else went down is quite important for us. Now, some of this, we build internally, we find some crude ways of associating things, that are in that related systems. But it's not always going to be that easy, right? So then there is the critical thing about signal to noise ratio, SNR, what we call it, right? Essentially how many of the alerts you are getting is actionable. Typically, the rule of thumb should be that if an alert is not actionable, don't even have that alert. Alerting is not a place where you log stuff. That is not the way to do it. Right? If you want to log something, create a daily report, weekly report or whatnot. Right. So that is the way. So in all these themes, right? So my observation about what will take in this, my perspective, is that you will have to go a little bit of a hybrid way with multiple solutions. Some would be vendor, some would be open source, some could be you build something, right? But the thing is, you need to strike a balance between both innovation and cost. And when you have somebody, some vendors who are specializing in the observability, they will bring some innovation. So you have to use that. At the same time, you need to also make sure that the cost, there's no cost overrun, right? And the cost is in control. But to do this in the right way, right? You have to be in control of your data, especially the data collection, right? Your observability data I'm talking about. So let's say your agents that you will look at what kind of standards you use. Try to use open standards for emitting any sort of data, right? Open telemetry is what typically is the gold standard now. So try to stick to those open standards, open collectors, and most importantly, build a data pipeline or an observability pipeline which can carry this data, split it, duplicate it, redirect to a number of places, so that you can have vendors on one side, your own solutions on the other side, and pick and choose what you want to do, right? So if you do that, I think it will deliver the most value.
Yeah. So one of the things which you talked about, Safir, is something which we come across very, very often with our customers of this build versus buy debate, right? And while we have certain customers who felt that it is something which they should do themselves, but later realizing exactly what you said, right? That there are just so many different options or things you need to take care of, and bringing in that sort of industry knowledge, then the SOPs, then making sure that you basically take care of those. Whenever a problem happens, you bring it back to the system, and so on, right? That is what we see does not really happen, right? So I think that's very well put, that people have to find a good balance in terms of what they really want to achieve, and whether they should really build this internally as well as, or go with a vendor, OEM vendor like us, right?
Right. Yeah.
That makes real sense, right? uh, so I think we are towards the end of our time, but I just want to ask you one last question,
Sure.
in terms of, see, you have written a book, right?
Right.
Is there anything else you are currently working on, which you would like to share with us, like new book or some tools, something else?
So yeah, I have another book in the early stage of discussion. So last time, when I wrote the book, I went solo. This time I have, good co-author. So we are working on we have decided the theme, but we are drilling down on what exactly work out on that one. What all things will go into it, but it's going to be towards around the cloud native landscape. And of course, there are other things like writing blogs, work with some of the communities, tech communities, things like that. That is happening, and of course, the I do some bit of consulting, other things. So all those things are going on, but yeah, overall going.
Cool. Thank you so much, Safir, for your time. It was really good talking to you about observability, SRE, and demystifying some of these aspects of what generally people feel about SRE. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks a lot for having me. It was great, with great pleasure. Good talk.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Safir today. If you really like this, please share it with others who would be very interested in this topic of site reliability engineering or DevOps. For more information about us, please visit us at www.viewnetsystems.com.